I think you put it like the back street. That might be a problem for me. Yeah. All right. How's it sound? Cool. This is actually kind of weird for me. I'm deaf in one ear too, so it's like a really weird experience to hear myself like amplified like this. So yeah, thanks for showing up too. I really appreciate all you coming through, being interested about Kyoto Style. This is my passion. For those of you who've stopped by my booth and tried my coffee, you know that I love Kyoto Style coffee, and I'm really happy to share with all of you how I got started in this, and show you how to build your own brewers at home. So just by a show of hands, how many of you are familiar with Kyoto Style coffee? You've had a Kyoto Style coffee, you've tried it at home yourself. So hardly anybody here has had Kyoto Style coffee. We all know that cold brew has been a really big trend in the past couple of years. And I started doing Kyoto Style in 2012 after first having it at Cafe Streets, which is a cafe here, very well-known cafe locally. But in any case, one of the main differences between Kyoto Style cold brew and regular cold brews is that Kyoto Style is drip cold brew instead of a steeped cold brew. So you can think there are two different ways to make coffee. You can either steep it as an immersion, or you can do a drip style. So your immersion styles would be like an inverted AeroPress, a French press. Your drip styles would be Chemex, any sort of pour over. And you're just working using different dynamics to actually extract that coffee. And that ends up giving you a different result completely. So the kind of long story short of it is, drip coffee is more efficient at extraction than steeping, because you're constantly adding fresh water to the coffee and then allowing that water to go out of the system. You just have better extraction potential for that water being introduced into the grounds. So for that very reason, you have to use just less water overall to brew the same amount of coffee to a perfect extraction. You won't be under extracted, it won't be sour. Many of you who've tried regular cold brews in the past, when you try to make a really strong concentrate, you'll notice that sometimes you run the risk of having an under extracted coffee and it comes out kind of sour tasting, and that is due to the efficiency of trying to make a concentrate using immersion. So that's one of the things that really drew me to Kyoto Style to begin with. I love textures a lot. So first of all, I love coffee, period. I've been drinking coffee since I was 10. But in any case, it was Sanka. That was my first coffee, by the way. It's funny, drinking my grandma's coffee. But in any case, though, I love textures a lot. And we all know that when you're brewing coffee, one of the trade-offs that you often have to make is between body and flavor clarity, right? So on the one end of body, you have like French press. Great body, hardly any flavor clarity. The flavors are very muddled up, and it's hard to get the real essence of the coffee. I liken it to someone playing the piano, but just playing all in chords. They're just only playing chords, that's it. That's kind of what a French press is like. On the opposite end of that, you have something like a siphon or a Chemex. And Chemex gives you just excellent clarity. Like, you can really taste the individual notes. But that's really like someone playing the piano like one note at a time. You don't get the richness, but you do get all those individual characteristics in isolation so that you can really understand them perfectly. I don't like that trade-off. So that's one of the reasons why I love espresso, for example. With espresso, you can get great body and you get flavor clarity all in the same experience. Kyoto Style is exactly the same way. And that was one of the things that I noticed about it that really drew me to it, more so than immersion cold brewing. So I'm going to show you the way that I came up with my original Kyoto Style home brewer. I wanted to get one after visiting Cafe Streets. I thought it was really cool. You've all seen the glass towers. If you have not, there is a booth out there that has one of them, a small version of it. But the one that I saw at Cafe Streets was huge. It's like this tall. And I really wanted one quite badly. So after having that coffee, I went home and Googled it. And there were about 300 reasons why I didn't get one. So I was like, dang, I guess I have to build one. So I went to the Science Surplus store. Well, first I just did some research on the basic principles. I just said, what are the principles of Kyoto Style brewing? So you need a dripper that can drip coffee at a rate that you can measure really carefully and granularly. And then you need a chamber that can hold the coffee, and then a carafe. So kind of deconstructing that, I said, okay, what can I use to drip the coffee, because that seemed like the most complicated part of the issue, and that is actually the most complicated part of this setup here. So I ended up remembering from college chemistry that we use something called a separatory funnel, which is this glass piece right here. And separatory funnels are used to titrate, basically when you want to introduce two different compounds to each other at a slow rate to find out what is the rate in which they do a certain reaction. You would use a separatory funnel to introduce it one drop at a time. So it's like perfect. I have something that can introduce my water one drop at a time. AeroPresses, if you've ever seen a Kyoto Style Brewer, it's a chamber just like this. So an AeroPress is perfect for it because you basically place a filter in the bottom. You don't need the plunger at all, so you just invert the AeroPress. And now you can drip your water right on top of these grounds here and achieve the same effective principle as a Kyoto Style Brewer. And lastly, just a carafe. I wanted to do a mason jar just because I like using mason jars, but I can't find any of my mason jars. It's so weird. So I have to use my nice Hario kettle. Really happy I didn't break that on the way here. So in any case though, just to kind of backtrack on just how bootleg my first setup was. It's really funny, and if you go to my blog, you can see the notes that I took at that time. I was using this, but instead of a AeroPress and this pitcher here, I was using a condiment squeeze bottle, a condiment squeeze bottle that the bottom was cut off of it, and I turned it upside down. And then I put that in top of the pitcher for my blender because it fit perfectly in top the hole where you put like bananas and stuff through. So, and then I had that sitting in a bowl just in case the whole thing fell over. So that's, we come a long way since then. Now I have a company that actually turns 2 years old tomorrow, all upon the principles of Kyoto Style Brewing. Just to walk through the simple setup of it, Kyoto Style is very easy. You just have to focus on the principles of coffee brewing. So the first thing is the source of coffee that you use is important. So you have to find a coffee, whatever works for you is fine. Whenever people say there's a certain coffee that works for cold brew, that's not true. There's no espresso blend. It's just like, what do you want to taste? Once you find that coffee, you're going to make sure that you grind it at the right setting, which for Kyoto Style, I find around a 5 setting, a paper drip setting for Kyoto Style. Generally, the finer you can take it, the more extraction you'll get. You run the risk of bitterness, obviously, and there's a whole conversation to be had about extraction percentages and strength and TDS readings and using the refractometer and all that stuff. Didn't come here to talk about that, but that is a core part of how I do my operations. Like, I'm using all those tools. But for the person at home who doesn't necessarily have $300 to spend on a refractometer, you're gonna just rely on your taste. So you will have to just experiment with it, go in there and just iterate and have fun. Maybe take a couple pounds of coffee and say, hey, we're gonna do a Kyoto Style experiment with these pounds and find where I like it. Based off my taste though, I would say you will find yourself at a paper drip setting for the grind. And then as far as your ratio goes, you're gonna find yourself between 7-to-1 and 10-to-1 water to coffee. So for every 1 part coffee, you'll do 7 to 10 parts of water. From there, you'll have to discover a drip rate that works for you. For me, I've like 4 drips every 6 seconds. Now, I know I'm throwing a lot of figures at you guys right now. It's a lot to remember. I see some people are even taking notes. So at this moment, too, I just want to let you all know that I went ahead and put the notes to this lecture on my blog. If you want to read that and follow along, I can tell you the name of my site. It is KyotoStyleCoffee.com, KYOTO, stylecoffee.com. You just hit the blog tab, and then just watch, the first blog post is going to be just the notes covering all the specifics of what I talked about. So don't feel like you have to necessarily write it down. I did notice that for whatever reason, iOS users sometimes have an issue accessing my site. If you're at home on a desktop, if you're an iOS user and you can't reach my site, feel free to just access that from the desktop. So in any case, we're going to walk through the specifics of how to get this started. So obviously I just eyeballed this water just because we're just doing a demo. Unless you guys want to sit here for 8 hours, we're not actually going to taste the product, so you just have to trust me on it. But in any case though, you've already established what kind of grind you want to use. You've already established the ratio. These are key pillars of coffee brewing. Anytime you want to make coffee happen at a high level, you do need to mind the ratios. It's critically important, and I would recommend that you just use grams. Just get used to using grams for everything that you do. It makes life very simple. So in any case, we have our measurement of coffee, our ratio already set here. So now we need to introduce some water to these grounds to get them saturated. So the one thing that you'll notice about coffee grounds is basically you have to get them pre-wet in order to have them accept more water. If you were to simply run this at a high rate of speed, you would get something called channeling, which is basically where the grounds that were saturated first continue to be saturated first, and no other grounds get saturated at all with water. You end up with a channel through the coffee, that water goes straight through, and you get very bad extraction. So with this process, because it is a slow drip style, you do have to introduce that water at the beginning very slowly. So what I would recommend you do is you take your coffee, and I know a lot of times with the Kyoto Style brewers, they often put a filter on top to dissipate the force, because as that water is dripping, it creates a tunnel that it can eventually kind of carve through, and just you'll have a hole straight through. That's because the drips are falling from a pretty high height, so they have a lot of energy when they hit the coffee. So for this one, because it's so close, you don't necessarily need it. You can do it if you like, but you don't need it. So in any case, you're going to take your entire setup and just put it under the... actually, let me walk through the components of this real quick just so you guys can know specifically. And like I said, this is all on my blog too. So this is called a separatory funnel. This is a ring clamp. This is a lab stand. So I just went to a science surplus store and got all these parts. AeroPress included, which is right here. This was $80. So if you already have an AeroPress, it'll probably cost you $50 to make. It's much better than $300. And the coffee is amazing. But in any case though, at this point, we just turn the rate on, this dripper here, and you want to just saturate that first, like maybe third of the coffee. So at this point, it's okay for the water to be standing just a little bit. So I would probably put just like that much water in there first, and let the coffee fully accept that water. You might want to walk away for a minute and go do something else. Patience is really the key with Kyoto Style. If you try to rush it, it will just go apart. And also another thing on the topic of patience with Kyoto Style, once you have it in here, you want to make sure that you don't agitate it in any kind of way to create channels, to create uneven wetting. Don't stir it. That's not necessary. If it is not going the way that you want it to go, you will have to abandon it pretty much. So that's just kind of how it is. I found that if you stir it, what happens is you create a gap, an air gap in there, and then it will completely not work at all, and you will just be frustrated. So the best thing to do is just really be patient, let it take time, introduce the water slowly at first, and then you can finally go up to your 4 drips every 6 seconds. So I got a little bit of acceptance of the water here, so I'm gonna just go on a little bit more. So, and because this is a small setup, there is some water already dripping through. With the larger setups, it takes a while before it drips through. Don't take this as a sign that it's ready to go. That's just water going down the side of it, so you really want to slow it down and like take a lot of time with this. So it would be very boring if I took the amount of time needed to let this completely set up and get fully saturated, but you're probably going to be looking at just a 10-minute setup, just kind of getting that going. Introduce some water, let it sit, and then finally you can use a metronome app to establish your drip rate. You will have to go back and check in on it occasionally, because as that water level drops, it will begin to slow down. But I've noticed that a setup of this size doesn't take the full amount of time. One thing that's really remarkable about the efficiency of Kyoto Style is that you can brew a perfectly extracted, great cup of cold brew coffee in 4 hours. I didn't think that was necessarily possible, because when you're introducing that fresh water into the system, it's able to get all the things that it needs out of it within that time of 4 hours. The reason why immersion takes so long is because it's very inefficient. You have, if you can kind of form a picture in your mind, you have grounds free floating in water. That water already has coffee in it, so its ability to remove more coffee is greatly diminished. And the water that is surrounding the grounds, that's the closest to the grounds, if you can kind of zoom in on the individual ground, it's always going to be a little more saturated. So the effects of osmosis are not at play in your favor there. That it's always going to be a little bit stronger right around the ground. With this, fresh water is always coming into the system. You can cut the time into 1/4. So that kind of blew my mind about this particular process. Any questions at this point? Yeah.
Should the coffee be packed before you introduce it?
So that's a good question. I find that if you pack it, you might run the risk of packing it unevenly. And also one thing about, at least if you pack it with the AeroPress, so if you use the plunger, you pack it, and then when you pull it out, it just sucks it right back out because it's an AeroPress. It's really tightly sealed. So it's not going to help you. And then if you like use a spoon or a muddler or something, then you're adding unevenness to the process. And that would be kind of like tamping an espresso with like a muddler where it's not going to be even, so you will run into channeling. The thing is, like, you will just simply have to, and with this coffee, because I just grabbed some just old style coffee, so this coffee is probably not like the best example to use with it, but you just really have to just keep doing that process where you're just slowly adding water to it, letting it get saturated, and then eventually you can just fully let it go. So thanks, that was a good question.
That 10-to-1 ratio, 7-to-1 ratio,
Yes.
is that what you have right there in front of you? Or
What I have is completely eyeballed just for visual purposes.
the 10-to-1, is that what you have already ready to go in the top chamber and bottom chamber?
Yeah, so basically that 10-to-1 is basically saying for every 1 gram of coffee you use, you would use 10 grams of water to add to it. So,
I know some Kyoto Style Brews add ice as time goes on. How do you control that ratio?
That's a good question too. So basically, just to kind of talk about that, I have not noticed that ice plays a beneficial part in Kyoto Style Brewing. Room temperature seems to be totally fine for Kyoto Style Brewing. I'm not cold brew Jesus though, so you know, if you want to play with it, because honestly the way I figured all this out is by playing around. So if you want to play with it, you know, feel free to play with it, but in my opinion ice didn't really necessarily do anything. But the great thing about it is it still holds true that if you weigh the ice, when it melts it will weigh the same. So if you use ice, you would just use 10 grams of ice for every 1 gram, or you know, a combination of ice and water. So hey, what's up?
So you started doing like a steady stream of water to get it saturated, and then you go directly from that to the drip rate that you want.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to see if I can hit that while I'm demonstrating, because it still needs a little bit of time. But essentially I'm just kind of filling this up with water.
Saturating it right now.
Yeah, I'm still saturating. I'm still getting it introduced, because if you can see kind of back here, dry spots. Wet spots in front, but dry spots in the back. So I need to chill for a minute and let it kind of accept that. So it's a process. You know, you front load a lot of the work and you do a lot of the work up front, but then on the back end it's like awesome because you just let it run and then you end up with great coffee at the end. So yeah. Anybody else got a question? In the back?
How many hours does this process take?
So the small one, it takes like 4 hours. The larger ones, like, so for example, mine is really big, and that one takes like up to 16 hours. And also another thing you'll notice too, so because I like to nerd out about the real specifics of this, you'll notice that dark roast and light roast behave differently. So dark roast will generally accept water much more quickly, and I don't know why, but I find that when I run my dark roast, they generally go faster. Like the water just gets absorbed by the coffee faster, more evenly, and it just runs faster. Light roast, they become kind of waterlogged in a way, and I think maybe it's because they have a higher water content. That might be a reason, I'm not sure. But definitely the light roasts take a longer time to get going. But the result is still the same. You end up with, you know, just a really smooth product. If you haven't stopped by my booth, please come by and try some of my coffee. I'm offering both light and dark roasted coffee, so you can just see kind of how they behave. And one of the things that's really interesting about this, because you do get that flavor clarity with the coffee, I know a lot of people say cold brew is low acidity. It might be. I'm not a scientist. I haven't like taken lab samples and said, hey, what's the acidity levels of these? But one thing that I've noticed about Kyoto style cold brews is they still sparkle. Like when you use, like so for example, I have a Brazilian coffee that I'm offering. And Brazilian coffees are not particularly known for having acidity, but I'm noticing Meyer lemon in mine from a cold brew. So clearly, cold coffee does have the potential to extract acids. I wonder if just the immersion style is probably not showing that particular side of coffee off. Because I do notice that when I get a traditionally immersed cold brew, it does kind of have a dullness, but the Kyoto styles generally will maintain that sharpness. If the coffee has acidity, it will present the acidity as well. So.
Have you ever found it beneficial to try doing hot water?
You know, I played around with it in my head, but I never actually got around to doing it. I don't know why. Like, I just found that this was working so well for me. I never did it, but that's not to say you shouldn't or anything. Like, you should experiment with everything possible. At some point, maybe I might, but as it stands right now, I'm just very happy with the product that it produces. You know, it just, I don't know what deficit it would fulfill exactly, because I'm able to get full extraction. Like, I'm looking at my TDS readings, and you know, I'm getting really strong coffee. Like, my TDS readings are like 4%, which is crazy. That's crazy. Like, like for real, no exaggeration. That's weak espresso. And then my extraction percentages are really good. They're up like 21.5% extraction percentages with like hardly any bitterness. You know, just like fully developed sugars, leaving the bitterness behind, still great acidity. So that's one of the benefits of having the VST tools, the app, the refractometer. If you guys want to do this kind of stuff professionally or just more seriously, at some point it's a great investment to have. For the home person though, generally you just rely on your taste buds.
Yeah, so you mentioned, I think you go from 4 drops every 6 seconds?
Yes.
And is there like a scientific way you can get it that precise, or do you just eyeball it?
Oh yeah, so basically you just use a metronome app, and then like, so for example, I have this dripping right now. So I would just set this up with a metronome app that I have on my phone, and it just beeps, and then I just kind of match the beat, and you know, you see this is dripping pretty consistently now. So that's kind of what it looks like when it's going. I would probably at this point actually run it like this just a little bit, just to continue to introduce water and let it get fully saturated and just kind of check in on it. The thing about coffee is, because you're dealing with just thousands upon thousands of little particles, they all behave in their own little chaotic way. So each time you do it, you'll have to do something just slightly different and just kind of build the intuition and really feel it out, for it to go the way you want to. So.
How much does it cost to build?
So the separatory funnel and lab stand were $50, and then the AeroPress is $30 for shipping. So $80 total. If you already have the AeroPress, it's only $50. So, and then you can also use this to make different so basically you can put grain alcohol in here, and you can make herbal infusions as well. So for example, you can put Everclear in here, and then like different herbs and spices inside the AeroPress, and do little tinctures and stuff like that, and start to play around with that. Because I used to work at a place that did that. They had a $300 Yama, the official brewer, and they were just using it to make limoncello. Yeah. It was great limoncello though. Cool. What's up?
Your professional setup, how big is the, are you using the same, just scaled up larger?
Yeah, I mean, I essentially took the same principles and just scaled the principles up larger. Same thing. So I'm using it holds what? I want to say 20 gallons of water. So it's it holds a lot of coffee. Yeah. I mean, I'm using like 15 pounds of coffee in there.
How long does this take?
16 hours. This process takes longer, like making sure that it gets fully saturated. You got to check the cylinder and make sure like it's all even. So I generally like to wait until it's about like a third of the way down before I start to speed it up. And with a setup that big, big, you have to kind of ratchet it up. You know, you just go a little bit faster, a little bit faster, a little bit faster on the drip until you get full speed. So, yeah. You know, actually, any other questions? Because I like coffee in general too, cold brew in general. Kevin, who organized this, he asked me to field any cold brew questions too. So I can field any questions about regular cold brew as well with the time that we have, because I pretty much went through what I wanted to cover quickly.
Have you ever used the coffee as water and done a second extraction with new beans?
Like a percolator?
No, just like do the whole thing and then take that finished product and do it again with fresh beans.
Almost like you would alcohol to up the percentage of alcohol, where you take the first product.
Gotcha. So basically you're saying brew one batch and then take that finished product and use that finished product to brew another batch? Gotcha. That's actually, I love that question. I love that question. I've never done that. And the reason I've never done that is because it's actually completely opposite of the principles why I use this. So, and that's not like a put down. It's not a put down at all. Like, when I say I love that question, I'm not being sarcastic. I love that question because your gears are turning. You're like, what can I do differently? You know, what is the nature of coffee extraction? And that question really gets down to the nature of coffee extraction, which is rooted in the ratios that you use. So the thing about using water that already has coffee in it is its extraction potential is less. It can extract less coffee. It's already saturated to an extent. You can think about this in the same way as you would washing a car. If you went to wash your car, you would get your car cleaner with fresh water than you would with dirty water. You might get some of the dirt off the car, but you're going to put some dirt back on it too. You know, the potential to wash a car with muddy water is just less than with clean water. And I think of each individual coffee ground as being like a dirty car, and and I'm trying to wash it clean. But I don't want to strip the paint from it. Stripping the paint from it would be, in my mind, having a really bitter coffee. So it's like I want to wash it with enough water to get the thickness that I need, but not go too far. But also not leave anything behind and have, you know, a half-washed car. And that's kind of the game that we play. So you'll notice, and you know, if you ever wanted to go and kind of verify that experiment, which I actually would recommend, you know, it's fun to experiment. But yeah, just take some brewed coffee and try to brew more coffee with it and see what happens. What you will notice is that it will have a higher TDS, so it will be thicker, but the flavor development will be unbalanced. You will have perfectly extracted coffee mixed with under-extracted coffee. The second batch will be under-extracted. If you did the first batch right, it'll be perfectly extracted. It'll be uneven. It might fall flat completely. It might taste sour, because under-extracted coffee typically has more acids as a ratio, you know, to its sweetness. So you'll probably notice a sour thing. One of the things about coffee extraction in general is there's an acronym. It's called LASA. Lipids, acids, sugars, and alkaloids. So those are the four components of coffee, and that's pretty much what you're trying to get into your cup. So the lipids, I like to think of, I work with metaphors in my head. So I think of the lipids like sprinters. They come right out of the gate very quickly. When you brew coffee, your lipids are the first thing that get extracted. Next thing are the acids, and they're almost like baton runners. Okay, so the lipids, they're done. They sprint it, they're out. The acids, they're going to run at like a medium pace and keep going. Eventually, they pass the baton off to the sugars. And this is going to happen around the 18% extraction point. That's when the sugars start to develop. This is between 18% and like 22. Some people are even pushing it to 24, depending on like, you know, your grind modality and stuff like that. That is the range of sugar development. That's everything. The 18, I mean, I'm not going to say it's everything, because the acids and the lipids that come before that, they all play a crucial part. But when you go and look at stuff like, do you guys follow like Barista Hustle or anything like that? Like Matt Perger, when he did his whole thing about the EK43 and why it's so amazing, which it is, because of the grind modality of it. But in any case, what he was really focusing in on is that range of getting the maximum sweetness before you get to bitterness. And his philosophy was, you want to take the coffee as far as you can, approaching bitterness, until you get a bitter cup, and then move one step back, and then as the maximum sweetness, and then make everything even as far as your extraction goes. So it's like, Acidic, acidic, sweet, 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 bitter. Once you hit the first bitter cup, you move back, and then now you're playing in Sweetville. Population U. So, any other questions? To stop by my booth and ask me and try some coffee. And once again, thanks for showing up. If you produce any of your own contraptions, make any sort of innovations that you don't want to patent, please share them with me. You can visit my website. You can visit me on social media as well. We're handing out cards for followers. So thank you very much.